Welcome to another episode of Chats with Atheists. This is Father Antonius from Sydney, Australia once again, and I'm joined once again by Peter Bowditch, active atheist and member of the Australian Skeptics, I believe.
Yes.
Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Now, our topic for today is going to be morality. So what we're going to be talking about is the idea of good and evil, and the idea that we as human beings have this sense that there is something that we can call good and its opposite, which we can call evil, and the sense that it actually matters whether you choose to do good or to do evil. Those who grow up in a Christian faith obviously have this drummed into them from a very young age and grow up in that sort of atmosphere and attitude. But many Christians that I've come across have the idea that if you're not Christian, then you can't really be a good or a moral person. And I've also come across many atheists who take great offence when they hear this. So we're lucky today to have Peter with us, who is an atheist and can perhaps tell us, how do you feel about this question? Can you be a good and moral atheist, Peter?
I think you certainly can. I find that this tends to be one of those things which comes in the form of an attack. It's basically saying, and it's a diversion, if you like, from the real argument. You say you're an atheist, they say, therefore you must have no morals. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the existence of God. We're not talking about the existence of morals. Most societies, whatever religious background they have forever, have had certain sets of rules. And these rules seem to be innate, if you like, in human beings. We don't murder people in our tribe. Outside the tribe, different story altogether. We might be able to do all sorts of things to them, but within our own group, we don't kill people. Incest is gone. Now, before people knew anything about genetics, incest was always seen as a serious crime or a sin. There are moral things that we just don't. There are things we just don't do because they're part of. To do them would cause a breakdown of our society, and we're social animals. So I don't think we need a God to be good, but I don't think that having a God makes you good. I'm probably not wording that correctly. I find it quite an offensive statement, and it's generally actually said, and normally when I've had it said to me, it's been said with malice, which is quite strange. When someone says, I'm going to be a bit evil now and tell you that you aren't very good.
Well, unfortunately, I think it's the sort of in-group mentality that comes out that we as human beings have the desire to feel that my group is better than any other group and so on. But let's pick at the logic a little bit of it. I think when somebody does say that an atheist can't be a good and moral person, I think the kind of reasoning behind it is probably something like this. If you believe in God, then God has laws and commandments, and because you worship God, then you have to follow those commandments. And that's why you do good things and don't do bad things. If there is no God, then there are no laws or commandments. So therefore, the atheist must just be basically free to do whatever they want. But obviously that's not really the case.
Obviously people are free to do what they want. I mean, one of the concepts of... Well, the concept of sin and redemption is, of course, that you have some free will to do things and that there are consequences. And that's what the second chapter of Genesis is all about. It's about responsibility, consequences, and being able to atone for yourself later. You can correct me on the theology there, but I think I'm half right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the description that I've given is probably more of an incomplete description. And I've given it because a lot of Christians grow up thinking that way. But I think a mature Christian theology actually says that's part of the beginning of your life as a Christian. Yes. Whereas as you sort of mature in that, you no longer are doing good and evil, or doing good and not doing evil because of reward and punishment, but you become the kind of person who believes in goodness, if I can put it that way. And you do it for its own sake, not for any reward. And you avoid evil, pretty much similar to what you were saying, because evil has bad consequences. It destroys me. If I get angry and hate you, I may not actually damage you at all, but I've actually damaged myself.
Yeah.
And that's why I shouldn't do the evil. Can we sort of find some common ground there, do you think?
I think that's, when you get to that position, that's actually the position that someone like I have.
Yeah.
it has always worried me, this idea that people only behave because of threats. That is, no, I'm only a good person, I do all these good things because if I don't, I'm going to go to hell and be tormented for eternity. You really need a better reason for that than that. So, and if the reward is heaven, I'm not quite sure what sort of that reward is, because heaven always seems to be defined in the terms of the current society. What would be really good now? I mean, if you ask now what heaven is, it's now very high-speed internet access and things like that. I think that's right. I mean, thinking Christians, and not just Christians, people in all religions have these same sort of rules. I think that they reach a point where they behave well or do good things simply for the sake that that's the way they feel they should behave. Not because they're threatened if they don't behave that way, or that they're going to be rewarded if they behave in another way, opposite way.
Yeah, well, there's the famous verse in one of the letters of John that says, "Perfect love casts out fear." So the relationship should be for I think the mature Christian is not a fear thing but a love thing. Although we still teach our children that, and I've no doubt you probably taught your children when they were little, so when they're little and they don't really understand the subtleties of life, sometimes you just have to give them a reward or a punishment to teach them to do the right thing. But of course we hope they'll grow out of that one day and have their own sense of morality. So we speak then of good and evil. Maybe if we can delve into that a little bit more. In the late 20th century there was a very prominent idea that there is actually no such thing as a real good or evil, but good or evil is just how you define it for yourself, a kind of a relativism about morality. It seems to be less popular these days from the things I'm reading. I just wonder what your perspective is on that. Is there a real good and evil?
I think there is. Although I've heard people argue the other way. The idea that there's a relativism, that you can choose yourself, decide what is good and what is evil, I think that actually, if I can put it this way, is an evil idea. I don't think we can actually choose ourselves to decide what's good and what's bad. Excuse me. There are obviously pathological people who will behave badly just because of their nature. Most of us aren't like that. There is the argument that evil itself is something defined by external criteria, if you like. We point at something, we say that's a bad thing to do. Yeah. Because we have rules about it.
Yeah. But then where do the rules come from? I think that's the question.
I'm not sure where the rules come from, but there is a problem in saying that it comes from God, because we've now started to define what is good. Now, is it good because God said it is, or are we defining good, God as good, in terms of our own definition of what a good thing is? So it becomes a sort of circular argument.
That's an ancient argument, isn't it? The Euthyphro dilemma, I believe it's called.
Yes, it's one of those ones that will never go away because...
well, actually, I think I can help you with that one, Peter. I think there is a very, to me, a very sensible response to that, which is God is goodness by his nature. So it's not that because God says something is good, it becomes good, but rather goodness is the reflection of what God is. Kind of thing. So it's not something external to God, it actually is who God is. And I think that solves that circular argument.
Yeah, I think it does. Certainly. I mean, if you're going to define a God, that's any acceptable kind of God to believe in, that God has to be a good God.
Well, by definition, whatever he is goodness, basically. Right, He's the boss.
I think, though, that history has shown us that people can actually behave badly, for no apparent reason. I mean, the classic case of this over the last century was, of course, Nazi Germany, where one of the most civilised countries in the world, one of the best educated countries in the world, the people went mad. And nobody could... People are still looking at the psychology of it and saying, what happened to Germany? Well, what happened when you look back, it was a long history of anti-Semitism, a long political and social and economic issues arising from the First World War, which gave the opportunity for Hitler to come to power. But realistically, if someone like Hitler turned up today in the United States or in Australia and tried to get elected, they'd be ridiculed, laughed at and ignored. But for some reason or other, an entire population was able to be convinced that they could be complicit in what was essentially the most evil thing that anybody could ever think of, a genocide of an entire race of people.
Yeah.
So, okay, so people can say they didn't know it was happening. It's a bit hard for a lot of those people to say they didn't know. But yes, that was an evil thing.
And I think most people would agree that it's evil. Probably even people who were Nazis in Germany but have since had the time to reflect on it and think about the consequences of what happened. I imagine most people, apart from those psychopaths that you mentioned earlier, would have this idea that there is actually, a genuine evil. And I'd like to delve into that a little bit more.
I think that people in place don't know how they're going to behave when they're placed in certain circumstances. We've seen this with some of the experiments with Stanley Ingram, for example, and the Stanford, the prison one. They placed people into roles and they started to behave in a way which they couldn't have predicted they were going to behave.
Yeah.
So there's certainly some part of that. People can actually do bad things for good reasons.
That's very
and
true.
that can cause enormous problems. I was, when I was at university, I was doing a course on moral philosophy. And we were talking about, one of the things we've been discussing, I was doing it at night time, was unintended consequences. Or being involved in something where you had to balance off good things against bad things. And we were giving the example of how they would put the workers, a worker accommodation munitions factory, inside the factory. So if you had to go and bomb the factory, you had to kill the innocent people.
Yeah.
I came out of work one day in the city, and in the building I was in, there was a Japanese business, tourist business, had a display in the window. There was a man standing looking at it. And he turned around to me and broke down. He'd been involved in the bombing of Leh Harbour in the Second World War. What the Japanese did was they positioned hospital ships in amongst the military ships.
Oh dear.
And he was still, 40 years later, concerned about the fact, even though he'd done it from a remote distance, from way up in the air dropping bombs, that he had dropped bombs. It was a war crime. It was in breach of everything he believed. He must have killed people he didn't intend to kill.
Yeah.
And he had not got over that thing. But the only way he was able to survive that was by survive psychologically with it, was to be able to say, well, some good had come out of it. And so I don't know how I'd react if I was put in that position.
Of course. Now, can I ask you a bit of a philosophical question here? That obviously is our reaction, but what is that reaction? When we have that guilt response to having done something we know is evil, is that simply just something that's wired into our brains, or something that we need to survive? Or is that based on, once again, an objective and like a real good and bad that's as much a part of the universe, say, as the laws of physics, as E equals mc squared or whatever? And the reason that I'm asking this question is, this I think is one of the differences between the theistic and the atheistic points of view, which is that the theist, the Christian, can say, if there is a law of good and evil in the world, well, that's a reflection of the nature of God, and that's where it comes from. What I'm interested in is, if one doesn't believe in God, where does the law of good and evil come from?
I don't know if I can answer that question. People a lot smarter than me have been trying to answer that for a very long time.
Sure.
I think it's part of being human. I think we know, we have an instinct about things we should and shouldn't do to other people. Yeah. It goes back, I suppose, to the golden rule type thing, that all societies essentially have a rule which says that you shouldn't do things to other people that you wouldn't want done to yourself. It's interesting that's often put the wrong way around. That you should only do to other people what you would like having done to yourself. As someone pointed out to me, if you're a masochist, does that necessarily mean that everybody should like being hurt? So I think I prefer to put it around the other way, that you should treat people the way that you would expect to be treated. And most people would expect to be treated fairly and not be arbitrarily killed just because they happen to be where they are, or who they are. So I think that there's an innate sense in humanity of what is a form of right and wrong.
Sure, but
it might only be a very broad idea.
Yeah, but what you're describing is a practical thing. It benefits both of us if both of us are nice to each other. We'll both have a better life. But that could be true without there being an actual good or evil. So for example, we could ask the deeper question, well, what's to make life better? You know, what's to say that comfort is better than discomfort, for example?
Yeah.
You know, or peace is better than war. In the end, if all there is atoms and energy, you know, does it really matter in the end?
It's for some reason or other, I think it does, and I think it can matter without the necessity for a God out there to make all the rules. I have no objection if people want to have a God make the rules for them.
Sure.
It's just that I think that society or humanity would survive in the absence of a belief like that, because we have this innate feeling that there are good things and bad things that we should and shouldn't do to each other. You know, people innately know to look after their children. Yeah. And damaging children is seen as a serious issue no matter anywhere in the world.
That's true.
Even in sort of bizarre cases like the total collapse of humanity, if you like, in places like Somalia, we see the damage being done to children and abuse of children as something which is wrong.
Yeah. There are, of course,
and it's being done by people who know it's wrong and done for political reasons. That's part of the serious problem.
There are, of course, extremes at the fringes of humanity, I suppose, like the Eskimos, apparently, who I believe some Eskimo tribes have a tradition of, in very bad winters, they actually leave their newborn children out in the snow to die, simply because they know that they're not going to be able to feed them and everybody's going to go hungry. But even in that case, it's not just doing it for no reason.
No.
It's a kind of sacrifice one to save everybody else. We still, you know, I think there is a lot of evidence that we do have this innate thing that there is a real good and a real evil.
In that case, they don't do it unthinkingly. They don't say, look, let's chuck this kid outside. There is a rationale for it. There's a reason for it. It's not every child that it happens to.
Yeah.
So we would see that as being a strange and bizarre thing to do. But I don't know what it is. We don't live in that sort of environment. We don't live where you don't survive through winter and there's no food.
Yeah. Well, something very relevant to people like myself these days is the Arab Spring, of course, and the revolution that's happened in Egypt, we being from Egypt, where I think the Egyptian people of all faiths basically realised that they were being ruled by someone who was in it mostly for themselves, and the country was suffering, and they kind of stood up. And yet the interesting thing is that for probably 30 or 40 years before that, they'd been accepting of that situation. So I wonder if, without a strong foundation for good and evil, a really compelling reason for following it, apart from practicality, could the world not be susceptible to another Hitler or another Stalin, another Pol Pot?
I think that these things can happen. So I've made the example of Somalia, with the total collapse of all government in the place. It's essentially being run by madmen, if it's being run at all. I think, yes, that could come back. Luckily, in most of the democracies, we have the things in place to try and prevent that. We learnt from the German experience about how you can conduct elections, how you allow people to get themselves to positions of power.
Yes, and Egypt is still learning, may I say,
Egypt is still
record.
Learning. A lot of the Muslim countries are still learning because of the way that that Islam is so tightly linked to a political system. That is, it's you can separate out a Christian. You can have a no establishment religion in a Christian country. You can't have a non-establishment religion in a properly Muslim country because religion is about the law, it's about politics, it's about how the place is governed. And I think that's breaking down. It's encouraging to see. I believe the crowd that was in the middle of Cairo last week was the largest crowd ever put together in the history of the world.
I believe so, yes.
In the millions. I hope that people in Egypt get what they want. That is, that they get a country which is safe to live in, where people can say, do, believe whatever they like, without being harassed, without being attacked.
To what extent do you think then that a country, so speaking of a government now or a state, to what extent should it be involved in morality, and to what extent should the religion of the population govern what the morality of the country is? So if we look at Egypt, you've obviously got a Muslim majority there. Should Christians be allowed to practice their faith freely there? If you look at a country like Australia, where we have Christian roots, similar sort of constraints are often put on people who are not Christian, possibly including, atheists.
I think that, I have no objection to people expressing an opinion.
Yeah.
And again, I have this fight with the atheists all the time, where I say, why does the newspaper go and ask George Pell his opinion on abortion? Because George Pell has a legitimate position on abortion because of his job, and is perfectly entitled to talk about it. We don't have to take any notice. That's the difference.
Well, that's a free country, isn't it?
It's a free country. But he's perfectly entitled to speak and say what he has to say about it.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll be very surprised if George Pell came out one day and said, and for those watching overseas, he's the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, if he came out and said, well, yeah, I think abortion's okay, it's just we've just been wrong for a few years. He's not going to do that.
No.
Whether his views can then influence public policy is a different issue. We're luckily here, I think, in Australia. We seem to we've been a secular country from the word go, which is was very smart of the people that wrote our constitution, that people have freedom of religion to a certain point, but there is no state religion. So nobody can be not given a job because they've, all given a job because of a particular religious basis.
Yeah.
So we've been lucky with that. The rules we make morality tends to be generalised rules. That is, we have rules against murder and certain sorts of crimes and rape and so forth. These are universal laws, no matter what sort of background or what sort of religious group we've got.
Yeah.
I worry when, say for example like Saudi Arabia, I find that sort of influence on religion and the government abhorrent. But I think Egypt will come out of this very well. It just may take a long time. It took an awful long time for Northern Ireland to sort itself out. And that was a fight between people who supposedly all believed exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, well, we hope it doesn't take too long. Look, one last point maybe for us to discuss. We were talking before about how the good is often the thing that works best for everyone. But may there be times when what is practically good is not morally good? So you mentioned abortion a little bit earlier. I think for a person like myself who would see life beginning at conception, starting from that position, I would have to say that abortion is therefore killing a human being, and that's a horrible thing. Obviously people who are pro-abortion would say life doesn't begin that early, or they have other arguments. Practically speaking though, it's also been shown that countries that make abortion illegal don't actually cut down the number of abortions that happen. All it does is it moves them out of the hospitals into the backyards, and you have a lot more disease and illness and that sort of thing. So is this an example of something where something can be practically reasonable and a good thing to do, to allow abortion to be legal, and yet it may be morally wrong if if you took the position that life begins at conception, then you're actually condoning murder in a way?
I think that there are a lot of compromises that we have to make to enable society to keep going. Abortion is a particularly tricky issue. I see it as an issue of timing. That is, I disagree with some people who say you should be able to do abortions at any time. I disagree with people who say you should never be able to do them under any circumstances. I know women that have had abortions for good and bad reasons. That is, but in all cases I respect it. It's been their view, their reason for doing it. Some shouldn't have done it. They should have kept the child and brought it up. Others should never have got in the position where they needed it in the first place. But had they had a child, it would have been disastrous for both of them. And obviously I'm not talking about medical abortions where there's evidence that the child is going to be born with such severe disability or deformity that it's really
it's not going to survive.
It's not going to survive.
Yeah.
And also it's just a case of saving the life of the mother.
Sure.
So medical abortion, I think in most cases, most people have never had a problem with.
No, and even as far as I understand my own church's view, medical abortions in those sort of circumstances are allowed. Yeah, but it is a tricky one though, isn't it?
I mean, I've met absolute anti-abortionist people who claim that under no circumstances should it be done. When they had this code, in fact, they've just actually changed the law in Ireland over this because of a case last year where a woman was refused an abortion and died.
Yeah.
And so they've changed the law in Ireland now to actually allow abortions if it's a case of saving the mother. And that was over all sorts of religious objections. A country which is still mired in religion. This is Southern Ireland, this is not Northern Ireland. Still an absolute Catholic country. They prohibit divorce.
Sure.
But they finally had to agree that there are certain circumstances where an abortion is legitimate and morally correct, and it's went to save the life of the mother. Because this case last year was just outrageous. There was no chance of the child surviving.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, without an abortion, no chance of the mother surviving.
Well, tricky issues, tricky moral issues. But
I try to stay right away from that one.
There are many more, but we've run out of time today. So I think we'll end on that point. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us today, and thank you to our viewers who have joined us today as well. Once again, I hope that it's given you something to think about, and we look forward to seeing you at our next chat. See you then.